History. If the story unfolds, it unfolds strong, almost suffocatingly long. Detailed and truly self-adhesive, one can sense a certain marking of the past, the far-fetched and obscure. Consciousness as Serwin spread his long fingers across the altar where the bull stood. His clenched face lay in deep slumber and the shadows etched along the pointed and beautiful nose. The eyes were deep blue and had a certain twinkle as he sprinkled a white powder over the bowl. It sizzled and he found himself stumbling again over the godlike banner of deepest woven together into a tree. The deep brown, gold-like lashes danced in the golden dark night. Serwin grabbed the banner and plucked it from the interlaced oak staves that held it. Like an icon. His fingers almost etched through the fabric and he took a step to the side. He clenched and the oak that lay brown and embroidered collapsed into a small knot in his hand. Serwin put it inside his coat and at the same time took out a small leather bag with a yellow powder and sprinkled it over the altar. It was blowing abundantly over the high grass hill and the trees behind it danced creaking in the wind. Serwin turned to a man with a youngster next to the altar. He pulled the youngster to him who immediately let out a clenched no. Serwin flashed quickly and drove a dagger under the youth's chin so that he sprang and flew backwards. A torch was handed to Serwin who held it in front of the bloody dagger. The youth sat crouched on his knees with his golden hair and slender face. Now the coarse man behind him burst into laughter. He chuckled merrily and coarsely so that Serwin kicked the youth in the chest, so that he fell backwards. Yes, take care, I, as your friend, don't need you anymore. Grunting in an archaic manner and playing with his fingers over the dagger, he set the torch by the altar in the holder on the side and sprinkled a few drops of blood into the I think I played over Serwin, said the youth, clenching his fists. Good, your lover will never know that, sir. Alderden, then stand up and act like a man, said Serwin, yanking the youth by the collar so that he fell forward towards the altar. Your oath, Serwin said, pressing the youth against the engraved altar. SSS. Storm of the vault, hear me now, I do not lower the guard from my deepest regret, back away, said the youth and sank down next to the altar, while smoke began to rise from the bowl. Red smoke and red shimmer. Serwin drew his dagger again and stabbed Alderden in the heart, causing the heavy eyes to gasp in shock. At the night sky, it started to lighten and the wind picked up even stronger than before. Serwin beckoned to the man behind the young man who had laughed and now fell silent. He fell silent because it was time to do so, not because he hadn't seen someone bleed before. The man handed Serwin the box and took a step back from the torch's light. His scarred face watched as Serwin unfurled a black silk robe and hung it in the place of the banner. That's Fergison, it was the very last of the Alderden family, he who spoke to the wind, he said lyrically and laughed. Serwin pulled the dagger from Alderden's chest and placed it on the altar. Serwin picked up the bowl in the flash and drank from it, then collapsed next to Alderden. Now it's my turn to be resurrected. He squealed forward and crawled towards Alderden, laying on top of him. Ferguson, I lead it now, he shouted at the rough man. But you can forget that, Serwin, Fergison replied, slashing with his sword at Serwin's head, severing it from his body. The head rolled down the hill, as Fergison watched. This was not part of our deal, Serwin the Dark. At the same time, Fergison collapsed and began to cry. Tears that had never touched their country before. He made a covenant with himself, the insolent coward, now it's my turn, Serwin. Fergison rose to the sword and stood, I swear by the dragon throne that if you ever taint our land I will separate all from curse and all from you. You, Serwin. Fergison screamed and was suddenly knocked over by a dark figure, pain rushing through his body, and he chewed on the frog. The figure didn't give way but etched itself into him until he stopped spluttering. Wrong, Fergison answered the figure as it disappeared into him. It's not the year of the dragon, but the year of darkness, Fergison. Corr Alderton Ferguson. Asterisk. 1 C Vol 1. The Beast of Chaos Rod. Prologue asterisk. The year is 117 in the second calendar. The snow lay like a blanket and swirled in the air, and all around howling icy winds pulled through brush and dense forests. The sun lay pale behind the thick snow-filled air, and it was barely visible at all. A lonely hare was looking for something to eat in the frost. A raven hunted hungrily for something to hide behind. The white fur made the hare pay attention to everything, and it wanted to move faster and faster. Volde stood ready behind the treetops and watched the two animals. His face was smooth and his pointed nose pointed west. The eyes were icy hard and had acquired a bluish tint. He whistled quietly to himself under his brown hair. His mind wandered to the wolf he had to be looking for. Or was it this werewolf he had been assigned to track down? Volde of course did not know, and he needed this hare as bait. Volde raised his staff and sent out a thin thread of magic to ensnare the beast, which of course succeeded. Volde realized that perhaps he should even run forward, and did so. His body was covered with har fur and leather so he could better cope with the cold. Volde stepped back in the meter-deep snow to the edge of the forest, which was full of pines and firs. After a while, he wiped the sweat from his forehead with his woolen mitten. It was time to camp for the night, he thought. It was long past 7 in the evening and the sun was going down. His thoughts revolved around his friends and what last happened a year ago in Alderney. Frid had begun to gather people around him, and he hid in the crowds from Boldeswall, who had been sending various spies to duel for a long time. Sure, he and San had protected her as best they could, but Volde had become increasingly preoccupied with his work as master. He was always out at work and chasing minor criminals such as the magician Alara. Alara was dangerous to deal with, to say the least, as he was dedicated to evil and teased the mages around the tree or the academy with his bandits. Boldeswall had actually ordered his men to stop Alara, and the order covered the academy. It was as if Volde had grown grey hairs recently and fallen into the trap. For he loved Frid like a sibling. So did San. When Volde wasn't on such missions, he toiled at the inn and put on various magic shows. Now that he controlled the threads better, he had become known even among the monks who now protected him. The prophecies spoke of Fergison returning as the protector of the people of Lindia. A wolf mother would give life to the daughter of the remaining ancient royal descendants. It was the prophecies that formed the main part of the monk's work. And even Volde didn't know all of them except the Beast of Chaos. The Beast of Chaos began when they defeated the one in Alderney. Saruan's spies would reclaim their ranks and return to battle. Volde's memories troubled him, and the dreams had returned more and more frequently. Finally he talked to Tagal and Travis about it, and they contacted Faisai, a medic who helped Volde put the hare on a stick in the middle of a Volde with the troubles he had. Of course it would help Volde in the long run. He watched the hare as its lifeline slowly went out. Volde picked up the hare and walked back to the edge of the forest and the hole he had dug with the help of magic. Tonight he would fight the werewolf. Volde took a few steps back and cast a spell over the area. He was strong tonight. It was a full moon, and it was the time werewolves hunted the innocent. Chapter 1. Sleeping Cold. Frid sat quietly and folded her arms while the maids emptied a tub of lukewarm water into the tub she was sitting in. It was a classic wooden tub and was filled with a lovely jasmine scent. Her hair had taken on a golden brown color, and her cheeks were increasingly pink and velvety soft. Her body was pink and curvy from the cold, and if you claimed to have seen someone else so beautiful, you had to travel a long way. Frid had gained some sharp edges, and her muscles were increasingly visible, like the squares on her stomach, something she couldn't explain the appearance of if she even tried. Frid half-heartedly listened to the maids when they talked about winter, and sometimes they whispered about men. There were always special men, and the ordinary ones were always after something. Frid performed more and more often and sang with San while Volde was always out on assignments, working on what he was doing now. Frid could sense revenge if he ran into the wrong people in the bar. Though he acted and fought like a peasant, took to beer just as San drank wine and smoked. Of course it was quiet on normal days and a little more lively at parties and weddings. San had started his work in his parents' home, and as soon as the time came they would start the collaboration. Of course, Frid was much happier as a singer, and that meant they could stay closed a little more often. San had done everything in his power again to help the neighborhood, and now that Frid and Volde were providing the entertainment there, he could open. Surely he had already done that. He was open 2 days a week. Frid made sure there was music when she sang because of course that was all a kind of dance, so she didn't have to stand in the middle, even though she loved to stand in the center later. They maids poured water on Frid so that she stretched her legs in the tub. It was cold outside and she wasn't yet sure if she would be working at all tonight. They now had full stock exchanges, and even if you wanted to now you could repair the inns 10 times over and still earn a penny and travel far from home. Volde was no longer poor, and neither was Frid, or San. Frid let out a slow sigh in the bath and ran the water through her hair. She bathed at least once a day and washed herself as soon as she could. Maybe twice a day. She had to sing today, they had planned, and since Volde was free from all work, they could enjoy the food and chat with the guests. It had drawn full houses, and today was such a day. Everyone spoke of Dawan the vanquished and mourned the elf who died in battle. Frid had been having dreams lately, and somehow they never found each other, so she dared to bring it up with Volde. Or San. Frid considered herself strong enough to handle the matter herself, and it didn't show a bit on her. Her eyes were soft and looked hawk-like at the mirrors in the small room. This was where you washed yourself, and here you were shamelessly allowed to sink down every day if you liked. The water was changed, and the towels that were gifts from the court in Bergamo were used extensively on all the guests. Those were not the only gifts they received, and the list could be made miles long. It was almost evening, and she hurriedly washed herself and got ready for dinner. You could already hear the music down on the first floor, and, as usual, San had started the guests so that the atmosphere was high. Frid dressed her slender body and ran the comb through her hair a few times and put it in a ponytail. As soon as she was done with the other orders, she could go down to the ground floor. They all lived in the same place, and of course it started to get really nice here in the evenings. Frid socialized with a crowd of people who were mixed servants and well-to-do. It was nice that things were going well these days. There was true joy in the whole work. It got colder when she got down the stone stairs, and apparently everything was really nice. There was laughter and the food was enjoyed, and Frid sat down at one of the tables next to San. San was clean-shaven and had a haughty kind of look she'd seen on some soldiers, but it was just an illusion. He was kind-hearted and friendly. Only after his parents were murdered did he care about both her and Volde. San was part of a self-image Frid had, and in many ways he was the point of view she could imagine what men were like. Maybe she was lying to herself when she naively pointed it out to her friends. They agreed with her regardless. It didn't matter how important she made herself. She loved Volde too. Frid was the one found left by the elves in the forest outside Tavel. She had called out her name to Volde's father, who carried her home, but now she realized that they were close to each other and were not separated as anything but siblings, so they had no relationship. It was lucky, otherwise Frid didn't know how it would have ended. Most likely she had more to collect from one or the other, and it had ended in a fight. Of course men are funny, and Frid was not a bad loser, but she knew when the limit was reached. San sat talking to Pol, and next to him sat Volde. There were people she hadn't seen before, and she wasn't surprised when Volde told a story about how he felled the werewolf. It was a story she hadn't heard, and she suspected he was in the clear about how he failed to implicate Voldeswall once and for all. All was forgiven. Voldeswall had been Played out of table, and like the thoroughly deranged loser he was, he gave up. Although he also had spies. She was once close to being accused of witchcraft. Now it was that Frid knew the healing arts and spells, and she managed to learn from Volde how to use thin streaks of magic from the mind. But always something was needed to activate the magic. A wand or a spell. Frid was careful to practice, and knew that Volde could, even when he was asleep, set the curtains on fire and throw fireballs. San looked at Volde. Yes, let's hear now, Volde, we want to know, he said, looking at Volde. Yes, it was 2 days ago when I was tasked by Tagal to hire someone to hunt for the werewolf. Volde looked to the side and focused his bluish gaze in the middle of the table. There were werewolves in the area, I didn't know that, said, placing his angular fingers on the table. No, tell Volde, said Frid. Well, it was too risky for anyone to come out there with me, I quickly realized. You know the curse, Volde said, sounding sincere. I've heard of that, torn sheep I've heard of, said Paul, stopping his pipe. You take incredible risks, Volde, San said thirstily, sipping his beer. Sure, and don't pretend about it either, said Frid a little sourly. No, I can't be anything but sincere. If it had turned out to be a wolf, it would have been over in a few hours. A werewolf seek the scent of blood from humans and animals, and must be lured out if they are only hunting for pleasure, said Volde, taking a piece of bread and dipping it into the soup. Frid looked at San and San at Paul, and Paul looked at Volde. Frid nodded at Volde. I caught a hare and baited it and had a spell clean up my pit. When I next looked, I found the werewolf and killed it. Before it died, it said something about some wolf girl. And if the truth is told, it wasn't just torn feet but body parts with tear marks, said Volde. No surprise there, thought Frid. I didn't think werewolves could speak, Volde, San said, making fun. San looked up at the ceiling and rolled his eyes. Volde nodded at Frid. Anyway, I need to find out more, said Volde and leaned back in the bench. This wolf girl, who is he? Paul asked. You don't become an adult here because you have fangs and fur and cut up poor lumberjacks, said Volde, scratching his hair with difficulty. The wolf girl reminds me of a fairy tale, said Fanir, who was an old hunter. There is a story about a girl who is supposed to be a godchild but must hunt with the wolves until the evil one is resurrected. Banner of the evil Sirwan, Funir said, looking at Volde and San. It is the first sign of the prophecies, Volde said in agreement. Again. Volde, are you serious? Frid asked, pouring a glass of wine and standing up. She began to sing in Elvish so that everyone in the room lost their breath. Peace took over so that all kinds of singing mingled in the room. San applauded and so did the rest. Frid's dreams of her hunting at night like an animal watched over her thoughts. Yes, and if we don't find him, what happens then? San asked jokingly. I have to find her, said Volde and conjured a flower for Frid. San nodded in agreement. First, Volde must find the wolf girl. Then, as master of the academy, he must follow the prophecies just like a monk, and then Frid, and lastly I will be drawn in because the wind is blowing in that direction. Oh, shut up, San, said Volde, embarrassed. No werewolf wants to be killed by a mage, said Frid. Funny and unfunny. Who said anything about killing werewolves? Said Paul, lighting a lighter on the pipe. Paul was Volde's father and strong as a lumberjack. I don't think you realize that we have to talk to her, said Volde and scratched one arm with difficulty. That sounds dangerous, Frid agreed, sitting back down across from San. But first I have to go to the tree and find out more, said Volde, letting his fingers disappear under his overcoat. San wore woolen clothes and preciously embroidered sleeves, while his pants were the same green color but had more prominent pleats. His clothes were of non-conductive velvet and the coat was the one that really stood out. It was a gray one with the Academy's embroidery on it. Frid's clothes were from Bergaman, and had the same kind of fabric as Volde's, although he didn't notice any embroidery. Hers was light blue along the sleeves, which were short like on a towel dress. There were pleats. The dress was expensive and Frid had bought it herself with only the servants as help. San Lum looked at Frid and then he started playing and she started singing. They went on all night, talking about old memories of old loves and Volde's magic. Since they really had something in common, they shared a table until it was bedtime and everyone went their separate ways, including San. Once he got out into the cold, he walked quietly through the yard that the houses divided into a square yard. San's thoughts wandered in the snow and he paced himself as his thoughts made him more or less unfocused. San nearly tripped around with eagerness when he finally arrived at his house. It was probably past midnight and somehow he felt persuaded that it was now time to maybe get some sleep. A stage that made him more anxious to tear down the cushions from the laundry room and bring a link of salami and maybe play a little flute. How it would work. He took a jug of milk from the bar and sat down by the empty campfire. Upstairs the servants were sleeping and he was finally home in his house. There was a smell of freshly oiled wood and a scent of pine lingered in the newly timbered hall. San felt how everything was spinning with intoxication and how he wanted to do something other than what Volde had said. Volde was reliable but he was also not very kind when it came to the prophecies. San played his new flute quietly and the music danced in the room. He had warned everyone that he would eat at Volde's. He was perhaps in the best quarters so he made sure that the guests could come and go as they pleased. He also brought most things with him. That was how San was and he was also modest when it came to such things. It was not always obvious that people wanted to let it go with the fact that the neighborhood was once the haunt of most robber bands and pirates. San played and ate well into the early morning before getting up to go to bed. He had had dreams about how he sought flesh and blood, how his sense of smell got better and better and how different desires crept up on him. The only ones he could talk to were Norn, Volde's, and their mother. But even she was sometimes sleepily cold when it came to such things. He had mentioned the dreams to Volde and received in response that Volde himself was talking to the mages and would then help San when he could. Volde had never been like that and Frid hadn't said much but forgotten it in the next sentence. He was sure of that. San drank from the milk as he got into bed. It was a double bed and a family heirloom. San didn't have much family left so he spent a lot of time helping the neighbors around the block. San soon fell asleep with his hands on his chest and he was vigilantly tired even in the dream. There he faced the shadows like a weary soul on a wander and in turn he fought with the undead and in the next moment he was drawn far into the land of dreams where he encountered apparitions of an older time. They whispered and talked among themselves about how far there was to go. San saw beggars and bodies everywhere. He saw shadows of a bygone era laughing and partying merrily while being truly revered as something. There was something bitterly cold about the desert landscape and somehow he felt more and more godlike. The dreams were woven together into a story of feats and clear traces of how he managed to overcome the sword. It was something he hadn't done. And San clearly knew that even though he succeeded in most of the dances he was already convinced that he really could. Shadows spoke to him demonically and San knew he was born of the dark sign. But how clearly it was he speaking in the dreams. It was a language San did not recognize. Although it reminded me of Alviscan. The rolling words danced in his ears and he responded in kind. He was clear about showing his rank. Then the dreams were switched again and he ran like a wild animal and threw himself over the battle, making sure to drink as much blood as possible. Now if he couldn't possibly have been an animal in all the dreams, San couldn't tell at the time. He was in such a state that there was no room for excuses or evasions. San was one in his animal all that night and when he woke up he did it on the floor again. San was really sleepy as he looked out the window. The snow was pouring Down and the sun was about to set again. San hurriedly put on his clothes and went downstairs to tell the servants that he would be staying open for a few days so they could tidy up the rooms. He thirsted for companionship. There was something dark about the dreams that made him want to bond with people. They listened eagerly to him and did as they were told. San wiped the sweat from his forehead and prepared his breakfast. He seemed to want more of a breakfast of sorts that morning so people wouldn't see he was seeking. San took a goblet of cider and drank, at first eagerly then a little more calmly. There was not to be too much of the strong stuff. San broke some bread and, shaking, dipped it in some kind of oil. After a while in the small kitchen, the servants began to work and San realized he was free from all the shaking. After about an hour he had eaten enough to start cleaning. This had been going on for a month and San had the same recurring dreams every night. The guests began to arrive. And some were long distance, others were returning hungry workers at sea. Tavel was a port town and every time someone asked about the boats, most people knew all the ships that came into the port. San talked to the guests and served food and drink. Some wanted to hear a song, others just the latest news. San felt a kind of harmony as he spoke to them. His loss was great and somehow he never found peace. He would talk to Volde again about the wolf girl. He wondered sometimes if it wouldn't be best to do exactly what Volde asked and sometimes if he shouldn't stay and work. San felt a little torn and it was as if there was nothing to rest his mind on. He had changed, dear San. Chapter 2 Hours. Volde Callahan sat quietly by the bed all that night, wondering if it wasn't a mistake to find the wolf girl, just because a beast had said so. Perhaps he had overreacted when he broke the curse of the pleading werewolf and then extinguished its life. Volde held Vildun's staff and it meandered with its thoughts and musings. Volde formed a few threads of magic and let it flow through around the room. It was his old chamber and the room was full of clothes and scrolls of parchment. The window was closed and a curtain hung over it. It fluttered as Volde raised the staff. He sat quietly and contemplated. His dreams and his thoughts landed on what Tagal had said. That dreams could interpret the prophecies. Volde wondered if it wasn't true. There must have been some truth. Slowly he formed a net with the threads and let them land slowly across the room. He then set the staff aside and faced the bed upright. Now he would venture into the dreams again. He thought if it wasn't for the best if he didn't cast a protective spell like the parchment scrolls had told about. Volde straightened up and leaned his head on the down pillow. Soon he would see. Volde fell asleep quite immediately and let his thoughts flow freely around a landscape in which he could form his shadows and essence. Volde first walked around in a world he recognized from the demon dreams. Then he was back in the place where he first met the one in his dreams. There was nothing in it. Volde waited and waited, then suddenly he felt a tap on the shoulder and a being ran past, giggling and laughing like a girl. The girl was Volde's age and had no clothes on. Her body was curvy and girlish with long blonde hair. "See you soon, Volde," she said, rushing past. When Volde dared to look again, she was gone and he was standing in a crowd in the middle of a desert landscape. There were traders and beggars, people in armor and demon-like creatures that went against him. Volde raised his arms and cast a spell at them. In the mirror land, they backed away and he found himself again in the midst of people in clothes he had seen in paintings in the academy. Some spoke to him, others laughed encouragingly and smiled. A few men in armor saluted and trudged past. A beggar came up to him and gave him a coin. Volde studied the coin and pocketed it. Volde's thoughts landed on the wolf girl and he slowly awoke from the dream. When Volde got up it was just after 5 in the afternoon. He first shook his thoughts out of his head and felt in his pocket. To his surprise, he found a coin that stood out from the others. Volde was at first appalled, then he began to shake. Confused, he studied the coin again, an inscription. indicating that it was from Doloven's time. Volde put the coin in his pocket and thought back 1,000 years, though he couldn't quite place himself there. The dreams and the coin had confused him. Volde shook his head and his face whispered sweaty and dirty, so he filled the wash basin with water and washed himself without thinking. His mind whispered to him that he must find the wolf girl. Volde slowly began to realize that he had to talk to the rest of the academy. He put on clean clothes and his body whispered muscular, hard from work and clear masculine features. Volde looked in the mirror and straightened his hair. After a while he pulled open the curtain and looked down into the backyard where the cows stood. Volde had soon built a place that was similar to others, although it still had its 300-year-old sound. It took another moment before he went down to the assembly hall. His old room was now open to him again. There sat the long-distance guests discussing the king. The king's new convictions had met them and new intrigues had flared up in Tavel. Those for the king met openly, the others kept to the harbor taverns, and daily things happened that Volde realized were purely violent, with acts of revenge and assassination. Paul was completely strict when it came to violence, and so was Norn. Paul had hired guards who disarmed the guests before they entered to avoid bloodshed. With exceptions, of course. The city guards arrested people daily throughout the city and especially in the inns. Volde wondered how San was, and he suspected that the dreams had reached him too. Volde took a piece of bread from the basket behind the counter and quickly stuffed it into himself. After a quick chat with Paul, he then walked out with the staff out of Doloven's here, under his arm. People passed him into the inn and greeted him. Volde didn't have time to say hello back, but pulled his hood over him and muttered a hello. After he got out into the yard, he went straight out into the center and turned back east towards the tree. The academy was also called the Tree, and it was a stately building with its roots in Vidun's circle, where he was also included. Volde continued straight to the stately building with lower buildings around it. The snow had stopped falling and he stomped in the wet snow to the door. Volde went straight inside in the heat. He was met by Travis, who was sitting by the door stacking rolls. His face was strained and he had let his beard grow out. "Well, Volde is back. Come in, you know," Travis said and took out his pipe and started to light it. "Sure, I'm always back, Travis. I dreamed of the wolf girl last night. Then there was a beggar who gave me a coin. By the way, here's the coin, Travis. How did you get that, Volde?" Travis asked, surprised. "Let's see," Travis said soon after. Volde took out the coin and gave it to Travis. It was a gold coin with the inscription Doloven and a picture of the king himself. He was well combed and had a long beard. Beggar with coins. It must mean something. Do you realize that, Volde? The prophecies. Travis exclaimed. Yes, I think it was something. Because the same beggar once showed me the demon's eyes and I remember it so well, said Volde, taking off his hood with both hands so that his knuckles were white. Sure. We must visit Bergamin and the library there. Bring some help with you. San. And peace. Travis said. We're leaving already tonight. So hurry. Volde barely got inside the door before it was time to leave again. Asterisk. Frid sat quietly by the mirror. It was late afternoon and she silently contemplated the contours around her eyes and smeared them with a kind of ointment she had made from aloe vera. It was an elvish recipe that she knew by heart and learned from Faceeye. As he was a medic, she could learn, which she did. And he taught her a course so that she learned everything between heaven and earth. Also names of bones and knots, muscles and teeth. She needed all that, and when Faceeye wasn't in the academy, he sat in the inn teaching people and monks as much as he could. He had once helped Volde out of a difficult predicament with a pendulum and salves. There were also incenses that he made and taught Frid about where to best find them. She silently looked at the features around her mouth and lubricated the area. Of course Frid was careful not to take too much because the salve could be turned into medicine, Norn had taught her. And certain salves could draw out evil spirits such as demons and ghosts. Frid straightened his shoulders and admired himself for a little while and sighed in relief. The minutes lasted. And her beauty was striking even if she was modest and a little wary of pointing out such a thing. Frid put the ointment down in her box and took out a kind of powder which she put on her face a little discreetly around the jaw area. The powder had all distinguished women and marked a clear status among the ladies of the court. But if the truth were to come out, they didn't need to. It was exactly the same with Frid. She anointed her arms with a kind of salve that smelled particularly good, which she bought down in the harbor. He said it came from more southerly latitudes just like the aloe stuff. Frid looked in the mirror again and stood up suddenly. She heard Volde at the door down there and San. Frid shrugged and straightened the dress from yesterday and went downstairs. She had slept like a princess and woken up without disturbing dreams for once. Frid had worked at the tables all morning. Something she had done since day one. As a child she had stood on the chairs and set the table. Frid saw Volde and San packing food in the kitchen. "What's going on, Volde?" Frid asked, looking at San who was standing by the cider bottles behind the counter. "We are going to Bergaman," replied San. Volde found a coin from the dreams in his pocket. "It must mean something," San said. "From the dreams, Volde?" "What dreams, Volde?" "We must bring us Faisai," was Frid's first reaction. She looked at Volde with her head bowed. "Yes, Faisai is coming, forgot to tell Travis," said Volde, nodding in dismay. "We might even have the answer here," Volde said doubtfully. "I do not think so," San pointedly said. "I've had dreams too. They speak a language that must come from the south," San said, taking a piece of cheese and took a bite. "I know," said Frid. "Me too," said Frid and agreed. "We are getting ready, Frid. Bring clothes with you," said Volde, implying that it was something Frid kept forgetting. San nodded and immediately understood what Volde meant and walked over to the clothes store by the laundry room. "We can buy new ones, I brought money with me," said San, packing up winter clothes. "How long will we be gone, Volde?" Frid asked, taking a piece of bread from the pantry. "Don't know, we're going to the castle, so dress a bit more challenging and not like Atlantis," said Volde. And took the last piece of soap and put it in his sack. "By foot?" San asked, implying that it was unnecessary to bring the horses. "Yes, we will bring Travis with us. He probably rents new ones in case it's needed," answered Volde. And left the room. His face was obviously sweaty, Frid thought to himself. "Yes," Frid answered soberly and followed Volde to Pol. Volde explained to Paul and Norn that they were going to leave. And they said nothing. San came out with the sacks of clothes and distributed them. One for Volde and one for Frid, the last one he kept himself. "I trust you, San," said Frid, looking soberly at San. "Sure, I just bought new clothes," San replied, laughing a cheerful laugh. "It is almost 20 kilometers on foot in winter," said Volde and put on his hood and turned straight towards the door with the staff in his hand and the sack on his back. "Best to put on your clothes," said Frid. San was standing at the door and on his way out last of all when the cold met them out there. Volde led the way in the snow and it was dark when they finally came out on the road to Travis and Faisai. San saw Frid slip in first while he and Volde waited outside in the snowstorm. Volde seemed concerned, so San said nothing. Although even San had his demons and really it was about time they came out. Volde had rushed into his house and explained to San how things were. Of course he had followed Volde without thinking this time. It was as if they were walking the same line he had seen at the Jester's Market once a year in Tevel. And how was that possible? San was born in the sign of darkness and didn't have everything that spoke for him like Volde. Yet their lives were intertwined into one. At the beginning. And at the end. It was always the same with Volde. This uncomplicated sibling love, they had all three. Volde watched silently before following Frid into the house that towered over the other houses. San nodded and followed. Finally they were back in the heat and met Travis. We have to get ready, I don't want to take horses with me because I don't know if they can handle the winter road. Travis said, and both he and Faisai nodded in agreement. Their faces were soft from the heat, almost reddish. San accepted a mug of tea from Faisai. It's wild berries, laced with a little rum. Don't have time to explain. But drink it quickly, said Faisai, looking meaningfully at San and Volde, who got one each. We have to prepare for the fact that it might be a little cold, so we have to take it easy. Besides, I see from you that all three of you have had the same kind of dreams. Faisai said, and Frid stepped into the room. None of us are even from the same family, San said, implying that it was strange. No, I understand that. I see that you San were born in the sign of darkness. And Frid is a bit of both, said Faisai, looking at Volde. In any case, you are clearly the one in the prophecies and we must be silent about when we are born. All means are now allowed. The darkness has awakened, so we must follow the prophecies, Faisai said, drinking from his mug of tea and rum. Travis was the one who refused the tea and it was clear from his face that he had already drunk a mug. Maybe we should get going, I trust you brought food, Travis said, accepting a piece of cheese from Volde. Good, we're leaving at this moment, Travis said, stepping out of the room. San followed them out to the yard and they set off on foot. Chapter 3 Journey and Destination. Volde sat quietly in the great drawing room of the Rooster Inn, watching a young woman almost dance across the room. Her long blonde braid lay straight and almost brushed against the light blue dress. Volde had a strange appearance. He was old and had warts on his face and a double chin, with a keen grey stubble. His fingers were calloused and his upper body was downright fat. His clothes were dark red and he had a yellow collar around his neck with buttons right over his protruding belly. He had a wobbly gait when he walked, though now he didn't stand tall in Bergamin, so he rarely left the inn at all. His co-workers fought over his orders and they noticed he was getting old. Volde watched as the girl served the various men who in their purple robes sat with their chainmails on. Volde Callahan stomped silently up a path in the meter-deep snow. His backpack weighed down and he staggered at times but stayed upright so the rest could follow. Volde had his hood on tight and the cold bit him this time if it wasn't the wind. The winter in Lindia was short and every time he went out it was very cold. Spring was on its way and it was clear now that winter was persistent. It was worse in Dual, in the north and in the east. In the northeast of the island lay the Nordlands, where you traveled if you wanted to speak with Tagl these days. He had opened an academy there and together they could exchange letters by ship or by pigeons. It wasn't excessively cold here, Volde thought and continued silently forward into the distance. After went Travis and Faisai, who were followed by Frid and San. They arrived at a grove of trees when Volde signaled that they should camp there. Volde took out some kindling and ran his fingers over them so they caught fire. He had a fire extinguisher but rarely used it. San lit his pipe and put down his rucksack and the rest followed him and sat down except Volde, who carried the food. Volde brought out a piece of bread and a few drinking horns for each of them, and topped up with apple cider and chunks of cheese. Travis asked for a piece of dried meat and got it. Volde rarely ate more than necessary of anything and especially not dried meat. But cheese was one of his favorites. He had cheeses from all over the world at home, so also salami. Volde took a sip from his drinking horn and took a bite of sausage and cheese. San took out his flute and began to play an elvish tune. Frid sat quietly and ate while the flames danced in the campfire. They were getting a little warm. Even though the snow continued to fall, everyone could enjoy the warmth and they talked quietly to each other. Everyone except Volde, who didn't say or hear anything. His thoughts wandered. To dreams and werewolves, to the wolf girl he had decided to find. Volde, I think we are starting to approach Bergamo. Travis said after a moment, breaking the silence. Yes. Volde answered. Maybe it's just as well to get to the academy in the castle. The tree probably wants to know about it. And we need to talk to Wald. Travis said, taking a slow bite of his piece of salami. Might as well take it with Wald. Said Faisai, looking at Volde, who was drunkenly sitting drinking and eating. Darkness had now fallen and you could hear owls and night birds. Yes, we'll take it with Wald. Agreed Frid and San in chorus. That's just as well, said Volde after a while. What do you know about werewolves, Travis? Frid asked after a while, drinking from his horn with a sweet smile. Werewolves? They're actually Baldiswall's task, but they are mostly found in the Nordic countries. Travis replied, lighting his pipe. In the Nordic countries? Everyone replied in unison, looking at Travis in astonishment. Yes, partly, trolls and werewolves. Travis replied. Troll? Volde asked, looking at Travis. Yes, the trolls are bestial and especially bloodthirsty in the northeast and south. Travis said, looking down the horn. Do you have anything stronger, Volde? Travis asked, holding out the horn to Volde, who quietly produced a finer brandy. I think I have stronger ones at home, but this variety is nice, said Volde, pouring into the horn. Yes, yes, now I feel the strength. Travis replied as he happily drank from the horn. There is a chance that the wolf girl comes from the Nordic countries, said Volde, pouring the stronger brandy into the half-full cider horn. Maybe we should go to Bergamo before we freeze, Travis said, and Faisai stood up. Yes, we're leaving, Faisai said, tucking in the last bit of his cheese. I think we're going after the trolls now, San said, joking encouragingly, and they then left their seats to stretch their legs. Volde, who had been sitting in the cold snow, got up a little slower. Frid got up last, with a smile on his face, and they threw snow over the campfires so that it sizzled and sizzled. San took the backpack and threw it over his shoulders and started walking towards Bergamo, and the others followed silently. It had stopped snowing when they reached the main road again, and Volde led the way all the way to Bergamo. San followed with Travis, Faisai and Frid side by side. Following the city guards, they finally entered a city that towered behind the ivory wall. There were people out even though it was winter and cold. Volde stopped and looked back. We should take the shortcut into the castle, Volde said, taking off his hood so that his golden brown hair fluttered in the wind. Of course. We will, Travis said, a little disappointed but still with some comforting determination. We make sure to take the fastest route, Volde. I want to know what the dreams are about, Faisai said, pulling her clothes tighter. They started walking again with Travis leading the way. The minutes passed and they arrived at the park and the wall. They continued straight up to the entrance to one of the towers and passed the guards there. The king is not at home, Travis said after a while. He is fighting wildlings in Alderney, Travis said. Stopping the same savages who took the capital after the undead, Travis said after a moment. They same savages? Asked Frid, not knowing what to believe. She said after a while. Calm peace. The ages became lawless when Sarosis moved, replied Volde and patted Frid soothingly on one shoulder. They entered the tower after a while and up the long stairs to the hall. San followed Volde and Travis. Frid and Faisai went last. They entered the great hall and walked up to Wald, who was sitting at the far end, next to a desk. Greetings, master, Travis and Volde said in unison. Travis took the lead and they greeted each other with happy faces. It is so, Brother Wald, that we have come to study dreams and their effect, Travis said, pointing to the library behind Wald. Take what you need, Wald replied. He was a sincere man behind a big white beard and had a kind of glow around him all the time. We really have time, but Travis, what kind of dreams are these? Volde asked, taking a step forward from the desk with a fast-moving body. It is our youngest master here, Volde, who has dreamed up objects. Travis replied, taking a deep breath. Can you show Volde the coin, Volde? Travis asked, putting an arm behind Volde's back. Sure enough, it was this coin. I got it from a beggar in the dream. Volde replied, handing Volde the coin. Volde replied, studying the coin. He looked at it with his raven eyes and weighed it in his hand. I've never seen one in gold or with the king on it. Volde replied, handing the coin to Volde. I see you have friends with you. And face I said, taking a short break in turn and going to sit down. Again. Yes, I have to help my friends for their dreams, said Faceeye, picking up his pipe. Good Faceeye, said Walt, taking out his pipe he had brought with him. Even San looked for his pipe under his coat. Volde showed the friends on to their guest room. Because he knew they had to stay in the tower for their own good, there was so much intrigue everywhere else. They went into their chambers and hung up their furs and went out again. Volde sat down at a table and picked up some food for them all and for Walt. They sat down at one end of the hall and began to discuss their dreams, and they all told what happened during them, and afterwards, San told about the first dreams when he was punished by the demon from Dawn. Frid told about the wild hunts in the forests, about how she became the wild animal and hunted as she wanted, something she had never done before. Warned about how the demon wanted to burn him alive. And the hunting eyes. Volde told about the wolf girl, about the werewolf and the beggar who now gave him the coin instead, about the desert landscapes and about how people stopped and greeted him. About the demons in the dream and how he cast the spell on them. They talked late into the night and continued when Walt had ordered food for them. After all, his mission was to protect the king and the kingdom. Volde sat quietly and watched the burning candles that kept the atmosphere in the tower room up. They sat and talked among themselves, and Volde did not feel left out, but chose not to participate all the time. After a while Fred wanted to leave and go to bed. San and Faceeye did the same. In the end only the magicians decided to sit at the table. Volde was tired again, but he didn't want to go to bed until they had gone through the library. Walt had obvious reasons to study them now that he had heard everyone's stories, and he pointed out that it was not made up. Travis finally came up with the suggestion that they go through the scrolls. They eagerly began searching for dreamers and gifts. Finally, Walt shouted that he had found something about the wolf girl and read straight from the parchment. Out of shadows and dreams, she queen of wolves finds her voice. The girl child from the family of the gods gives the gift that leads the way forward towards the light. Dolovan's key, godchild, Walt said, showing a picture of a very beautiful girl without clothes. Volde was immediately embarrassed and did not know what to think. There's a spell down here, Walt said, reading it. Arkaz-Zaun, he said, and the coin began to glow in Volde's hand. There you see, Volde, it is the coin that speaks to you. You are the chosen one, Travis said. Selected what? Volde asked, looking at the shiny coin. The chosen one. The bearer of light that the prophecies speak of, Walt said, running his fingers through his beard. We must act before the beast wakes up, Travis said, following Walt's example, running his fingers through his beard. The beast? Volde asked, looking at Travis. The beast of chaos, Walt answered again. Asterisk. Frid Callahan quietly entered her room, closely followed by San and Faceeye, who quietly opened their doors to their quarters. Frid went alone and put down the porcelain wash basin next to the mirror she had, and then closed the shutters to the window which had been left open for some reason. She lit a fire in the fireplace and slowly began to file if she couldn't necessarily go and wash. She did this and stood for a long time by the mirror, watching her body as she ran her fingers and soap through her hair. She had made the soap herself and didn't go anywhere without it in her backpack. Frid had taken a bar of soap in the kitchen. Her hair was foaming and she eased the dress so that her naked body was reflected in the mirror. She was really slim and beautiful all over. It was a kind of joy to see herself. She got as she washed her legs and blushed when she thought of the wolf girl. Not that she thought it was her, or that it felt uncomfortable to think so. It was the nudity that was something new to her, and she thought that Volde had now fallen in love with a small and wild young woman. Frid got ready and the golden brown hair was washed out with the other dish and soon she smelled of meadow flowers. She dried herself with a towel and put on underwear which were embroidered linen shorts. She went to lie down under the wide duvet and quickly fell asleep. Frid walked around the woods he used to dream about and suddenly started darting from tree to tree, from one branch to another, and as she did she felt as free as a feline. She ran away towards a cave, which under the branches withered and turned into a cornfield where she then ran free like a cat, hungry, and felled her prey. Frid suddenly landed in a desert landscape where all the houses were low and made of stone and not timber. The people greeted her and the soldiers saluted. Suddenly a figure lunged at her with a flashing knife and she parried with her hands and was cut. She heard Sirwan's name being mentioned and eyes starting to chase her wherever she looked. The figure was gone and the only thing she heard was a heavy laugh. Frid ran and ran while the eyes followed her. After a while she soon found herself at the cave again and out came a figure with a small dog by her side. Here, Frid. You will find me. Do you remember me, Frid? I am the valley and I am the one who hunts by your side. Until the time is right. But beware, Sirwan is after you, said the figure and disappeared with the puppy. After that Frid slept peacefully and dreamed of the puppy. She liked dogs and all animals, but what did they do in the dreams? When Frid woke up, she felt strange. She neglected to open the doors and just prepared another basin of water. She washed herself and put on her clothes and walked out of the room into the hall wearing her new challenging dress, with a plunging neckline. The hall was empty, so she walked over to the fireplace and filled a teapot with water and hung it over the fading fire. She put on wood and let the water simmer for a little while. Frid poured a mug of tea and sat down at one of the 4 tables, taking out some bread, oil, and cheese. They didn't know what churned butter was in Bergaman, and San had learned that because he sometimes got tired of working. Frid dipped the bread in the salty oil and ate. She took a small sip of tea and listened intently as Faisai came out of her room and towards her. His face was not troubled but on the contrary, lively and happy, just as it should be. Good morning, Peace, Faisai said, nodding. Good morning, there is tea for you too, replied Frid and poured a mug. Yes, there is no churned butter in Bergaman, is there? Asked Frid, looking almost a little disappointed. No, you're absolutely right, Frid, Faisai replied, taking out a piece of sausage for them. There is chicken and fish, replied Frid and accepted the sausage and took a bite. I have some dice, Frid, Faisai said, and they started playing dice, Frid winning at first and then San and Volde came out of their rooms with Wald and Travis following close behind. The dice rolled that morning and they started playing with rules so no one could cheat. Voted 24. Peace 34. San 14. Wald 54. Travis 67. San seemed mostly absent and it showed on him. Frid almost got a little worried. She then told them about the dream and they listened eagerly. Faisai then took out an ointment and gave it to Frid. It was an ointment he had kept in a small box. This, Frid, helps you get into the mood. It works immediately. And San, I have a similar one for you, and for Volde, I just have to send for the casket in my chamber here in the castle, said Faisai, sounding really excited, mostly all the time. San nodded at Faisai and Volde and he scratched his head. I feel really tired, in fact I haven't slept at all, San said. The others understood what he meant and Wald led him back to the chamber. Before entering the room, Frid anointed his forehead with the salve. Try to sleep, San, we have to be ready when we leave," said Frid, and then turned and walked out of the chamber. "Yes, we have found the scrolls and the spell that leads us to the wolf girl. It shows us south from Alderney," Volde told Frid before he tackled breakfast. Frid looked excitedly at Volde as he ate, and his smooth face was less troubled and somehow felt reassuring. Frid sat next to Wald at the table and they chatted a bit. Her manner had changed overnight. She was now completely interested in this wolf girl. Frid seemed completely soothing without knowing it himself. It didn't fall on her when Wald asked questions about Tavel. She explained to Wald that it might be just as well to get churned butter in Bergamen. He just laughed and said that the fields around the city were all used for food and not for pasture. She could have figured that out herself, Frid thought. Since they had a lot to say to each other, there was no mistaking the way they talked. They were also happy and ready to find this God-sent girl that Volde forgot to tell Frid everything. It had always been that way, and Volde was special in that way. "Yes, we probably have to get ready for a trip south," Wald said, and Travis insisted. "It's probably just as well," Travis said, and started to stand up. "I'm getting some gear ready and looking for a boat to take us south," Travis said, gracefully walking out of the room towards his chamber. "Yes, we should start getting ready after we eat," said Wald. "I'm coming with you," Wald finally said, and got up to go to his room. Frid nodded silently to herself and looked at Faisai and Volde, who were sitting eating. She got up after a while and started walking towards her room. San Lum fell sleepily into bed and began to think, while the ointment ached. He became calmer and calmer. His thoughts were completely in harmony with the dreams, which slowly began to creep up. San was in a state of calm the rest of the time he slept and was not disturbed by anything. The dreams took place in a calm, and when he then woke up it was afternoon. San stood up and put on his clothes. His body was muscular and he was really strong. The lines were so well formed that one wondered if he did not beat the jesters in all their branches. By the way, San had tested it and it worked extremely well, 3 times. San reminded of the larger soldiers you used to see riding next to the king. They had a special way of speaking and behaving, that you wondered if they didn't belong together. San looked in the mirror and saw his dark circles under his eyes. They might disappear if he was allowed to sleep as well in the future. San straightened the white shirt and tucked it into the blue pants of a slightly shinier fabric. He straightened his back and washed his face in the wash basin. He had already washed earlier that morning to remove the dark circles and the smell of sweat. It was more and more common for him to use perfume. So he took some from a glass bottle that stood next to the wash basin. The scents rose and San made his way out of the room, slightly dizzy. After the hall with all the oil lamps and stone walls came the academy hall with magic in the air. He could feel it everywhere. They were already sitting together at the dining table and San walked up to them. "San, we are leaving when Travis returns, so bring some food," said Wald, lighting his pipe. San nodded and sat down to eat whole fried chicken. "We have come to the conclusion that we must find the wolf girl, so we already have a signpost." "Wanted," said Frid to San and stood up satisfied. "Yet, what does this mean then?" San asked, looking at Volde silently. "It's the coin. It shows the way to the wolf girl," said Volde, saying the incantation Arkaza Zaun, and the coin began to shine and shine until a beam struck through the room, out of one of the windows. San looked at it in astonishment and was about to say something. "There we see the signpost," Wald said, signaling Volde to put the coin back on. "Unbelievable, Volde!" San exclaimed, placing the chicken on the wooden plate. "Yes, of course it is incredible, San," answered Volde, and the whole room was in the mood again. The oil lamps on the walls illuminated the staves and banner hanging side by side, and at the back after the corridor to the rooms was a desk with a large library behind it. "Do you really dare leave all this, Wald?" Sens asked Wald, who was sitting on the short side of the Oblong dining table. Yes, San, it's in good hands, you understand. Wald replied, sounding like Bergamon's clucking dialect. Was distant, but it wasn't. The king left me behind and I have written and sent orders both to him and the rest of the tree to leave here and protect the castle and academy. We'll see when they get here, just. Wald said, sounding a bit youthful and simple. San looked first at Volde, then at Wald, and finally at Frid, who had returned in the neckline and rucksack with his fur unbuttoned. Volde nodded and stood up again and headed for his chamber. Then San followed towards his room. Frid and Wald started throwing dice. San entered his room and packed up most of the things he had brought with him and left the room. Again. Of course, he had not thought of a longer journey, but he had 3,500 silver coins with him. In any case, it would be enough for a bit. In case they were to buy clothes and sleep over in different places. He had what was needed. San stepped out of the warm chamber into the corridor and continued into the hall. Frid and Fisai were already sitting there. Just as he entered, Travis entered. Voldeswall has heard that you are here. We must hurry to the port. Travis said. The reason they didn't leave Tavel was the warm currents just outside Bergaman that lasted all year round. We have to hurry. Vold said from behind the long beard. He seemed peacock-like but very special. When he somehow gained speed in them. They got up hastily and grabbed their belongings and started down the stairs. San went first and Wald followed and after him went Frid and finally Volde, Fisai and Travis. They soon came out into the cold and up to a horse and wagon. Travis showed them into the wagon and the two horses were joined by Travis. The wagon was square and beautifully carved with wooden rims and red frames with two lanterns at the front. They sat down on either side of the carriage behind the doors and they drove off. The minutes passed and the city remained dark and snow-filled with different kinds of lanterns in the knots of the houses. People and guards came and went as the carriage rolled down to the dock. When the carriage then stopped, it was completely dark outside and they could get out into the harbor quarter, with all its taverns and inns. Some merchant stalls were open and they followed Travis to a boat called the Nettle. It was a typical fast frigate with crew and rooms. Travis knew the captain of the Nettle and they sailed many times on the same waters. The captain was tall and stately but bald on the head and had a long goatee. San boarded the ship and they were shown to their cabins by a sailor wearing blue clothes and a long overcoat. San entered his cabin and shared it with Volde. He immediately sat down at the table and opened a bottle of cider. I had no dreams at all last night. San said, taking out glasses from a shelf. That's good, San, replied Volde fleetingly and poured the glasses. San looked Volde in the eyes and they started laughing. That's very good, San, Volde snapped. They sat and talked until the dice rolled and there was a knock on the door. It was Frid with the same thought, so they continued out to the dining room and started throwing dice, until it was time to roll. Once out at sea, the party continued with rum and precious spirits and wine. They ate and drank until they realized they were free again. Asterisk. Chapter 4, The Choice of Path. Voldeswall had received word that one of his harem girls he had been assigned to hunt was in the city. And within minutes half the city was in chaos following his order to find her. She had to be a witch, she just had to be. The guards ran amok inside the city and turned everything upside down. He admired himself every time he did it and people would respect him. From now on. Just as Voldeswall was about to get up, a dark-clad man with a clean-shaven face and gnarled nose approached him. Voldeswall, my name is Fulu, I can help you, said the man with icy care. Voldeswall managed a yes and looked the man in the raven black eyes. It's like my master is looking for them too, said the man, sitting next to Voldeswall at the bar. There Voldeswall had sat questioning people until this fowl came up to him. How then help me? Asked Voldeswall. It is so that my master the great is looking for a youth named Volde. Fowl said, taking a mug of mead and drinking it right out of the mug. Asterisk. Volde, Callahan and San sat rolling dice in the dining room and talking to each other. Frid leaned over the table and had a crowd of sailors whistling merrily when they caught sight of her. All three of them were 19 years old and behaved in the same way and talked and partied with each other. Frid blushed every time the sailors passed, and somehow she felt it belonged there. After a while it had become night, and everyone disappeared one by one, and Volde was left alone with Faisai, and they spoke dreams, and Volde was given a salve against dreams to take, and Faisai had already given one to San. They sat for a few hours before Travis came up to them. "Tomorrow we land in Alderney, Volde," Travis said. "We have to be able to continue from there then," Travis said, stopping his pipe. Volde silently looked at Travis' pipe and studied the tobacco. He didn't have his own pipe but sometimes tasted San's. Volde didn't think it tasted very special, but understood that only certain people smoked pipes. There was special tobacco, and they used to buy home tables own and tobacco from Alderney. Volde watched Travis and accepted the pipe after Travis asked him if he wanted a taste. It didn't taste bad, but he almost coughed as the tobacco smoldered, and he took a puff. He was now a connoisseur and kept to everything. Just enough wine, just enough brandy, and just enough cider. He could drink almost as much beer as he wanted. Mead was a favorite when wild boar was served. Was eating the fish that was on the table and talking to the other guests. The other guests were a distinguished young woman, but not beautiful enough for Volde. She was funny and sweet, but no more. Her name was Adele. Adele talked about the southern lands and how they used to fight pirates and trolls. Volde found it interesting and agreed with her, and he told her about the undead in Alderney and about the siege. After the conversation, Volde went to his and San's place to sleep, and Travis, Faisai and Adele stayed and talked. Before Volde went to bed, he smeared the ointment on his forehead, right next to his temples, so he could sleep. Inside, San was already snoring loudly, and Volde got ready for the night. His lean and muscular body sank into the bunk, and he promptly fell asleep. The next morning they had stopped at the port of Alderney, and they were preparing for departure. They went ashore at 7 o'clock in the morning and were met by shipyard workers working and tearing at ropes and loads. To Volde's surprise, he did not see a single elf, but the cold wind blew over people and boats. Volde followed Volde and Travis, and after him went Frid, San, and Faisai. Finally they came to the road, and he hardly recognized himself. Here it was not cold in the winters, but all the snow rained away, and he could see plants and trees with flowers and leaves. Volde opened his winter jacket and pulled the hood over his head. He already felt watched, and if it hadn't been for the crows sitting in the trees and all the drunks roaming the streets with laughing guards and children, it would have been all the armed hunters and sailors. Finally they arrived at the strait that led into the city, and Volde seemed to catch all the buildings as quite different from themselves and people a little wilder. Volde approached an inn and asked them to wait outside. Then Frid took the opportunity to go to the market stalls to look at spears, and San followed to choose swords. The alders had become a dangerous place, Faisai finally told Volde, and Travis agreed. If they only knew, Volde thought. He was almost angry to see the alders in their current state. "You can probably hide the coin in a safe place," said Travis after a while, implying that Volde might not even be safe here. Volde nodded and put it in an inner pocket of the vest he wore under his winter jacket. Paul had taught him to buy clothes where you could hide things from Norn, Volde's mother. Volde had listened eagerly to everything his father said. Norn was strict and had incredible control over Volde and the house when she wanted it, and Volde was brought up that way and obeyed her blindly in all events. Volde closed the vest and looked around and saw merchants and beggars, children and drunkards. All carried weapons. He didn't hold the staff himself, but had it in his rucksack so that it stuck out on the sides, although he quickly regretted it. Volde took the rod out of the pack and weighed it. No one had given the slightest acknowledgement, but continued to flaunt around them, and some Sometimes got a little too close but quickly lost interest. Came out and looked meaningfully at them from behind the long beard and said, "We can shop when we're in town, although it's not safe enough to sleep here," said Wald, implying that an attack could come at any moment, and besides, the king was in the mountains hunting outlaws. Volde nodded and asked Wald about horse. Wald nodded. "Fast only for packing," said Wald, and Volde understood that it was easier to track several horses than one. Sanlam stood at the market stall studying the new swords, and most of them were masterfully crafted. Had long blades and stab-friendly naval weapons that could seemingly be used anywhere. At last he caught sight of his model and asked the round man with the turban on his head the price. It wasn't expensive but cost 28 silver, and San agreed. He received the sword and its scabbard, for which he had to pay 2 extra silvers, and fastened it around his left side. San was careful to help Fritz, so he approached her and paid for her spear. He also bought a bow and some knives that he intended to give to Faceeye. They mages already had their wands, and San hadn't discovered it until now. They again made themselves ready among men and beasts to depart. Wald bought a pack horse and replenished their supply. Sometimes San wondered how much money Wald had, but didn't dare ask. The morning slipped by and the sun was scorching hot as they prepared for departure. Volde had studied the coin one last time and it pointed south. Frid was happy with his new spear and was shopping for clothes as he got ready. Finally the time came and they set off for a while. When the sun was at its best, they had packed everything on the white-spotted horse and followed the road through the city gate. As soon as they were out in the open, San got the reins on the horse and walked beside Volde and Frid, who were both curious about the new stallion. The horse got its name and was called the Spot for the strange pattern it had around its neck. San laughed and joked with that horse, and it seemed downright lively. Finally they came to the edge of the forest where they had fought a battle with the undead, because it was right next to the road, and the bit after towards the mountains would look the same, Travis told. Wald led the way, whistling quietly to himself and somehow seeming fearful. He had told Taggle to travel to Bergaman and take care of the tree, which was important for the academy. San walked quietly and troubled that the birds followed them into the city and whispered to Volde about them. Volde nodded and told Wald, who realized these were the eyes of evil and managed to pair them with Sirwin. Wald then cast a spell and managed to lure them away a bit. You could see in Wald's eyes that he didn't agree with Sirwin. Travis had the same look and Volde was starting to get the same. Finally, they had reached some distance on the road and Frid wanted to sit down. San looked at the sun. It was gone 4 or later when they made the first stop. San fetched sticks while Frid prepared the vessels with water from a stream. They then gathered around the fire and sat down exhausted and lit the fire. San looked at Volde as Volde took out a flute he hadn't seen before. Then Faceeye told him about Adele, who had given it to him. San remembered the forbidden songs he had learned and took out his new flute. He tuned into the song, and those who could began to sing while Frid prepared the soup. After a while it became completely quiet and they started to chuckle a little. San then continued to play notes he had heard from the dreams, and Wald soberly exclaimed that he had heard it before. No one had asked Wald his age, so he told them. He was there when Tavel's academy was built 300 years earlier, and he then told about Vildun and his apprentices. How they once tricked a pack of wizards into coming with them to Bergaman and forming the library with her help. When she finally realized what she had done, she went berserk and poisoned the entire academy. Wald talked about the difficult years when he and Kobe traveled together to set things right. They searched for parchment paper for 20 years thereafter. It had all happened 30 years before Wald came to Bergaman. They did not know what happened to Vildun. He had disappeared, but all his things remained, even the scrolls. Wald then told about the rumor surrounding the troll pack. He was said to eat humans and animals alike. It was a risky business with such women, in the early days of the academy. It was from another age and told of long battles in the northern lands with pirate chieftains and goblins. Strange thought San because they had been talking about trolls. They were sitting up talking as darkness fell over the camp and somehow they had made it homely and San and Faisai would take the first watch. After discussing, San started playing music that best suited the food, which was delicious in San's eyes. He played a song called In the Far East. It was a song about Dolovan and his army. The soldier song fit in well because it was calm and not too loud. San took a bite of the new cheese and realized that it tasted just like Alderness cheeses used to. It was somehow magical. After sitting for a while, San decided to stretch his legs and he took a horn of mead with him and walked around the nearby forest. The night was chilly and he could barely see his hand in front of him, but still managed to hear night birds and feel the mosquitoes trying to approach. A few fireflies buzzed past him and danced in the air. It wasn't harsh, but still, this was what freedom felt like. San sat down again and put some wood in the campfire and listened to the birds. Faisai sat tying his sandals and a night bird flew by. After sitting for a while, they were replaced and San had to wake up Frid and Volde. San smeared himself with the salve and laid down with a blanket over him. He fell asleep quickly this time and didn't have much time to dream. Frid sat and talked with Faisai and Volde before Faisai decided to go to bed. It was maybe 3 o'clock when he did. Wanted to tell you about the wolf girl, said Frid firmly. Volde studied the fire and didn't really know where to start. Yes, she is a beautiful girl sent from the gods. She is needed and above all because I am the light bearer. We find her thanks to this gift, said Volde, taking the coin out of his pocket and showing it by the fire. Frid looked curiously again and began to smile. Volde, tell me about your dream about her. She was as beautiful as on the scroll. Frid sounded like an awkward little sibling when she said that, but deep down she meant it. Volde spun the coin back inside the vest and rolled his eyes half delighted. Yes, she is very playful and something very special, said Volde in his clear Tavel dialect. Frid and Volde sat like two chickens on a stick by the fire with blankets around them and talked long into the morning. They laughed and sipped a little wine and ate an early breakfast. Frid prepared tea and water and they talked among themselves. When Frid realized that she was in her home regions, Volde sat playing the flute when the others woke up and they prepared a proper breakfast. Frid felt suitably relieved when they finally threw water on the fire. She didn't know why, but her emotions were so overwhelmed and somehow it felt completely familiar. Walt and Travis fed the horse and led it to the stream, covering the droppings to make it difficult for any pursuers. When the camp was then cleared, they began their trek along the stone road towards the mountains and Volde studied the direction with the coin. Birds began to sing and they saw hares and foxes and the occasional deer running across the road or watching them along the road. The day continued at its leisurely pace. And they then stopped again to eat, but it was a small fire they made ready. Frid talked to Walt and Travis about the wolf girl and Walt told them about the prophecies surrounding her. She was quite a fairy tale in her waking state and her curls were like the midday sun and her lips like the morning sun. Her body was slender and curvaceous like the waves of the sea. She was the deliverer and the queen. Walt told about the queen who was in the former world order. If her beauty sharper than Sarosis and Sarosis was beautiful. Travis agreed and told about the queen of the north, how she was beautiful and difficult to deal with. Those who wanted the wolf girl by her side at all costs and planned to conquer the alders. The queen of the north was the daughter of a troll pack and she in turn shipped trolls across the sea. The academy had heard of this and gathered its army against both Fergison and the queen of the north. She fell on the sword that troll pack and was decapitated in battle by the wolf girl who surprised them in the south. Sarosis, who then lived in the forests around the mountains, took his people to Alderness and conquered the city with the wolf girl's help. And if Sarosis is there, the wolf girl is also there. Frid asked about the hunters and was told by Wold that they first fought with Fergison and then with the elves and promised Sarosis to be replaced whenever they needed it. And by the time of Frid's birth, evil had returned. Hunters the people were divided and the elves tried to save them but they disappeared in different directions. Frid had already heard about this but the wolf girl was something new and Wold told her that she had been kept hidden from all visitors by the elves. This was 500 years before, 500 years. Before that Fergison had been defeated by Volde's rod in the field. See Beast of Chaos Wand Volume 1. Volde looked at Frid with pleading eyes. Frid laughed and smiled. After a while, they came to an intersection that pointed in two directions. One went south, the other east. Volde again had to study the coin and held it upright. It turned out to be safest to follow the beam south. Frid and Travis went to discuss while Volde, San, and Wold took the lead. I walked quietly next to Frid and seemed lost in thought. It wasn't long before they got on the right road and no one really knew how far it was to the nearest hill, where the mountains were said to begin. The hills had remained since the First Age and they were the battlefields where Sarosis had faced the Queen of the North. Frid chose a campsite after a few hours of walking from the crossroads and they stopped at a forest grove with running water. The stream was good enough to quench the thirst of both horse and man. Finally, Travis fixed the campfire and cleaned up around the campsite while the rest lay knocked out in the grass. San sat playing his flute and Volde took off his shoes and anointed his feet with an ointment face I had. After a few more songs, Frid started cooking and the aroma spread in the small grove. The wildlife kept her spirits up and they discussed the food and watched the setting sun and joked wildly by the fire. The horse started to graze the spot. It was such a horse that liked to nibble everywhere, so they had to be prepared. It was something special to be able to drink clean water, the Stain thought. Frid sat quietly next to Wold and watched the sun as they ate chicken soup and bread with cheese and lingonberry drink with special berries for that Wold had bought in. It was far too good and soon they were all asleep and Frid and Volde next to each other with Wold and Travis as the first guard. San sat up and played for a while but then considered going to bed as well. Travis, how far do you think it is to the mountains? Wold asked, scratching his head. It's maybe 3 days ahead at the most. Travis replied, stuffing his pipe. I thought so. You are probably right, Travis, said Wold, starting to stuff his pipe into the darkness of the night. We're lucky right now considering the winter back home. Although Travis, what are we going to do when we find the girl? Wold asked, sounding sincere. Volde can decide that, Travis replied, taking a sip of brandy. He doesn't have to, the girl can decide that, answered Volde tiredly on his berth and burst into laughter. Manfred thought and fell asleep. Asterisk. Chapter 5 The Road to Bergen. Volde Callahan stood by the campfire early on the second morning. They had made themselves ready for departure and after they had done what they had to, they were finally ready to go. The journey was long, he had heard before falling asleep, and they were always ready with most things. Volde studied San as he washed his face with soap, something Volde had already done and was ready for most things. On horseback to save the girl, he jokingly pointed out to himself. Frid had braided his hair, in 2 thin braids on either side and to be honest, he had no hopes at all. Volde drank some water and ate bread and cheese as he stood looking for something to point out to San. He hadn't trolled either, in a very long time, but he'd gotten the hang of it, for the most part. No dreams had plagued either of them and he was a little anxious about this wolf girl. What would she think of him? Became a master at juggling and conjuring flowers. A godchild of her rank who was happy to show all of her beautiful body. It sounded like fairy tales, although he couldn't imagine himself inside them. Wold stood and packed the horse with his box and saddlebags while Travis fed it and cleaned up the droppings. Maybe if he was lucky he could come back with them too, though right now it didn't feel like there was much hope. I think it's just as well San takes the horse. Walt said so San could hear. San nodded and came out of the water with his light brown pants and bare torso. I'll take it from here. San answered eagerly and started patting the spot on his neck. Frid got up and walked over to the horse with a carrot and gave it to him. If you spoil it, he wants more. Laughed Faisai, taking a bite of his own carrot and slowly started walking towards the road. Arkaz-Zayun, Volde said, holding the coin upright, the coin showing the way by shooting off a beam of shimmering golden light. Maybe it was time to do something completely different. Of course Volde didn't know that, and he was just happy that it would all be over soon. They hadn't come across a walker. Not a soul settled for them. He was quite surprised that everything had gone so well. Volde took his time walking to the road and waited for San and Frid. After all, they would not have to fear being chased by Boldeswall. Not that. Volde was so naive that he believed they would find out about him in the future. Boldeswall was too smart for that. What do you think it will take for us to get over the mountains? Volde asked, looking his friends in the eyes, one by one. 3 days, I heard Travis say. Replied Frid, and Volde nodded firmly. Maybe 2 if we're lucky. San answered, and Volde scratched his head. Maybe San, maybe. Volde said, putting on the hood and looking into their eyes again. How lucky are we? Frid said, waiting for Walt while Volde walked forward to one end of the road. That wound between the hills and the thickets. Behind were the large fields. Don't worry about him, Frid, he's a bit eager, just. Walt said in an archaic way. Volde heard what Walt said and calmed down a little. Volde waited for the rest and finally came out of the bush. Volde started walking along the road, which was rougher now than before. What are we looking for? Asked San. Frid, and Frid shrugged in surprise. A valley, a forest, or a hilly landscape, said Frid at last. San waited for Travis, but ran into Faisai coming out of the thicket. Where did Travis go? San asked, looking at Faisai. Just then Travis came over and patted San on the right shoulder. San jerked in the bushes and turned his horse around. If we're lucky, San, we'll find Sarosis. Travis replied, and they slowly started to come up the road. San led the Stan up the road and up to Volde, who was waiting. We must hurry, said Volde, raising his staff a little. The other magicians, i.e. Volde and Travis, walked with their staffs. They were oddly shaped staffs and had secret names. The staffs had chosen them, just like Volde's staff. They were difficult to handle at times. Volde had tested. Yes, by all means, Volde. Travis replied as Volde approached Volde. You must take it easy, Volde, because there are really dangerous roads left, said Volde, and was interrupted by a strong howl. And about 20 hairy goblins exploded out of the forest canopy behind Volde. Volde spun around and raised his staff at the armed onslaughts. He threw fire away and knocked the first 3 goblins over so they started to burn. Frid threw the spear she had used as a walking stick straight into the face of an evil, grinning, hairy troll. The troll howled and was thrown backwards. San drew his sword and slashed between 2 red eyes, and Wald came to the rescue, hurling heather lightning straight into the arms of the remaining ones. Travis finished it all by laying a curtain of fire on the other side of the forest, where they came from. Volde threw another fireball at the last one, who fell screaming into the grass. At well done, after this we all go together, Travis said, patting Volde on the shoulder. The forest spread out darkly on that side, and now the friends began to walk rapidly away from the scene. They hadn't expected trolls this early, and somehow it could have been a nasty surprise. They could have been without. Frid had snatched the spear from the dead troll and continued down the road. She had been really scared, but at the same time quite angry. They continued forward with Volde, Walt, and Travis at the front, and Faisai, San, and Frid a little behind. After wrestling with the trolls, they came to an increasingly winding hill path, which they chose to go along. It got steeper and windier, and it was well past 4 when they camped again at a valley depression. It was to get away from the wind that chose that place. Carefully calculated. The rock wall behind them was good for keeping warm. They sat in a ring around the fire, and right next to it a small stream of water rolled by. San let the horse graze freely without packs with a blanket over it. That was it, they had with them blankets and food. Travis had to get wood from old trees that were stained here and there. And Volde rolled dice and face I watched. Frid was far too exhausted and sooty to even think of such a thing. She finally leaned back with her fingers clasped over her waist. The clouds sailed by slowly but surely, and the heat was quite high in the valley floor. The hours passed and they returned to eating and talking as darkness fell. The trolls had damaged Frid's calm, and she became a little worried before the night. Nobody slept very well, and Frid and Volde had the first watch again. They sat and almost whispered. The mood was low and they didn't know if they would make the journey there and home. What kind of troll do you think it was, Volde? Asked Frid, taking a piece of dried meat. Mountain troll or lowland troll, or maybe a bit of each. I don't know for sure when it comes to evil. But they had red eyes. Volde answered. You know what that reminds me of? Asked Volde, who obviously sounded a little excited. No, replied Frid. Dawan. Volde answered. If we encounter evil magicians, it is of the same kind. Replied Frid. Both yes and no. Volde answered. Dawan was not alone. Said Volde, and drank some water. Water was all they had left. Break some bread, Volde. Frid said, handing him a backpack. Frid rolled her greenish eyes and drank some water. What happened to the drink? Asked Volde, taking out a piece of bread and cheese. It ended yesterday if I remember correctly. Replied Frid, and accepted some bread and cheese from Volde. They sat and talked almost all night, and as soon as it was time to change, Wald and Travis took over. Travis was silent while Wald, behind his big beard, laughed when he saw that the pot they had made was almost untouched. He was very hungry and started eating. Travis kept watch a little above the rock wall, peering out into the night-black dawn. Only the stars showed the way. Frid fell asleep after she smeared herself with the salve, and soon she found a comfortable position. It was morning and they went up to wash themselves and eat what was left of the stew. Wald explained that they had enough food to get them there and back, as long as they didn't overdo it. Was there such a thing as exaggeration? San wondered and was told that they had to ration now. Volde thought they had been doing it all along, but Frid said it was best not to eat all the time and face I. And Travis agreed, even though they were now the two who ate the most. They cleaned the campsite and fed the horse by letting the spot graze freely. San packed the saddlebags and rucksacks on the horse so that it hung down along the sides. It wasn't excessively heavy stuff, nor something you wanted to wear, in case of racial or troll attacks. After lacing his shoes, he took in and watered the horse. Or gave the horse water, as it was so kindly called. He stuffed his pipe with tobacco and lit it with the lighter. As soon as they were all ready, they would set off. San took over the horse completely, even though he was fearless and really slow at times. Of course he had feelings just like anyone else and liked to be petted. San guessed how they had treated the horse and greeted it more kindly. After a long while, Wald went up the small hill towards the path. His beard had laces dividing it into shorter braids. Travis and Volde went right after them, and then Frid and Faisai, and finally San. The spot followed kindly, and as soon as they had come up they began their trek. San's thoughts wandered around the trolls, and he was quite embarrassed that it would take a little longer before they arrived. He thought mostly of the goblins and their sharp blades. He didn't want to end up in their stews. As soon as they came up the narrow footpath came the hills and heights, and finally the mountains. He had heard tales of dwarves and dragons and ghouls that haunted the mountains of Alderney. He didn't know what the mountains were called, but it was certain that if you fell down, you were completely gone. Suddenly stopped and raised his staff and fired a fireball. In seconds, Wild howls were heard and the same spell-like sounds and creatures rushed over them. San barely had time to react before the spot fell down the slope straight into the precipice, into the rapids. Towards certain death. San became enraged and drew his sword and began slashing angrily at the creatures. Their wicked grins and beats to teeth split and he danced to a third who was about to pounce on Frid and pierced it just below the hairy neck. Volde became enraged and threw bolts of lightning at them while Travis tapped one with his staff so that the 2-meter-tall creature spun around in the air and flew screaming down the cliff. Travis threw fireballs at the onrushing masses while Frid and San charged, drilling through one beast each. The horse fell with our provisions. San growled at Walt, who in turn hurled bolts of lightning that shook the mountain. Don't worry, San. Walt shouted back. San didn't know what to think, but the troll took flight and disappeared over the hills. We have to hurry now before they come back, cried Volde in a morning of blood and burning bodies. I know where we can find food, Walt said and started running, and the rest started running after. They did not stop running until the sun showed 4 in the day. Of course they didn't have the energy to even walk, and they had come to a high mountain massif. Berries grow here that are edible, said Walt. Just as I remember them. I walked up to Walt, who was standing by a berry bush. He examined them and took a handful of berries in his hand and sat down with his back against the rock wall opposite the precipice. They did exactly the same thing and leaned against the wall. Here begins the wilderness trail in the Aldna Mountains, Walt replied, and Travis agreed, squatting down. There is a pass right next to here, Volde. Look for the way, said Travis breathlessly, and Volde picked up the coin and said the spell Arkazazayon. The coin began to glow and emitted a beam straight towards the mountain pass. Exactly my thought, said Walt, putting down his pipe. San, collect some twigs and branches and we'll cook in this, said Walt, taking a small cauldron no bigger than 2 palms out of his coat pocket. Besides, Faisai has his backpack, said Frid, looking at Faisai. Just medicines and some food, Faisai replied, looking at them, one by one. Yes, his ration, answered Volde, and went forward and picked some berries. That's enough for all of us, Faisai said, opening it and taking out a few links of sausage and bread. 2 halves of cheese and a bottle of clean water. It may not have been a party, but they ate and were quiet that night. No one managed to sleep, and it was before the sun rose that they prepared for departure again. Everyone mourned Flicken and not least San. Volde and San started growing beards, and neither of them ever really got around to shaving. Finally, it was incredibly much more difficult to get there, and once they reached the pass they saw a macabre sight. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of bodies lay scattered, pierced with spears. They made their way past the dead slowly. No one knew what had happened. But Wald meant that it was the king's soldiers who had advanced there and left these robbers to their fate. Masses of scavenging birds had gathered there and were eating the dead. We have to hurry, said Wald, slowly starting to go through the pass. San held his breath. It wasn't far from the food coming out again. Frid showed the same kind of feelings, and so did Volde. Travis urged them through and over the dead masses until the end of the shift. They couldn't have been dead for a long. Once they were out in the open again, Volde picked up the coin again and cast the spell. Arkaz-Zayon, he said reluctantly, and the coin pointed the way to an open plain at the edge of the forest. Chapter 6 The Wolf Girl. Arkaz-Zayon. She felt the heat from the coin. Leons crouched quietly with only cloth wrapped around him. They started getting closer and closer. Her face radiated a rare beauty, and her body was like that of a leopard. The green eyes calmly studied the surroundings. Her arms and legs were like cast candles, and she felt the magic from her golden curls. Were they here already? She laughed and smiled widely against the midday sun. So soon? Her insides whispered, and she stood up with the cloth wrapped gently around her. She had momentarily forgotten that they were human and nothing else. Her father and mother were human too. Although she was called the Wolf Girl, and it was because her two companions got wind of something. Asterisk. Cascara asterisk, see Volume 1. The Beast of Chaos, bring down that wolf, shouted a knight in armor on horseback, and as he held his red banner it fluttered in the wind. Cascara smiled behind his helmet and had his spear aimed at the hairy beast. Suddenly the wolf disappeared into the thicket and forest. Profitless Cascara, said the knight again to Cascara in full armor and on horseback. We have to find the girl, Cascara exclaimed, laughing mockingly in the direction the wolf had disappeared. Your job is to defend the king and not chase girls, Cascara, the knight answered honestly, sounding strained. Cascara wasn't a child you had to babysit all the time, was he? Cascara jerked the reins and turned the black stallion. To be done, sire, said Cascara, riding up to the knight who had also urged on the runner. Asterisk. Volde Callahan was greeted by hooves and noise on the ground. They had walked right into the arms of the king's army. Wald asked Volde to stay away as he spoke to the court-martial, Tallow. A man rode slowly towards them and Wald greeted with outstretched arms. What's new from Sid Wald? Asked Tallow, who was a large man with a full beard and a golden helmet. Tallow sat on his white runner and held a spear. We are on a mission to find Sarosis, Wald replied. On what grounds? Asked Tallow. We are looking for a girl, Wald replied. Is there anything we can help with? Tallow asked in his clear Bergaman accent and cleared his voice. Preferably not too early. Maybe some food, we fought the goblins and lost our pack, replied Frid. Tallow, wondering if she had taken in too much. Tallow laughed and looked at Frid. I see you have women already with your Wald, replied Tallow. No such girl, but a special girl for the academy, Wald replied, sounding archaic and dry at the same time. Yes, we have seen a girl in the woods. But beware, she bites. At least the wolf does. Or how, Cascara? Said a knight beside Tallow. Cascara nodded from behind his silver-gilt helmet. Of course you will have food, Tallow said, biting her bottom lip. He signaled to one of the 20 guards beside him. Give them something to eat and keep your paws away from the women, said Tallow, turning the horse away, and they rode off, leaving the 20 guards. Cascara and 3 other knights rode after the marshal. Frid's heart had stopped, she almost doubled over. Cascara, she whispered to Volde and San. May they not recognize us, San whispered to Volde. Doesn't matter, Travis whispered to them all. You are in safe hands, Travis replied, walking up to the oncoming guard. The guards wore yellow and brown clothes with chainmail and swords at their sides. The camp is no place for women and children. So you can make do with what the king has to offer, sire. Wald, said the guard, handing Travis and Wald a sack each from the saddle of the horse he had next to him. A heavy fog began to settle, and while the guards disappeared from the field, Volde came to his senses. Again. He had prepared himself for anything. Travis and San each stopped a pipe, and Volde looked at the coin and holding it upright, making sure no one saw he cast the spell. Arkaz-Zayan. A beam found its way into the trees on the other side of the field, and they slowly started their journey back towards the forest. It was a huge forest that stood out. And it was an old one, told me. The trees stretched 20 meters above their heads. First went Volde, Wald and Travis, then Frid and San, last Faceeye. When they finally came to an imaginable clearing in the middle of the forest, they set up camp. San arranged a fire pit with stones, and Wald and Travis unpacked their sacks. There were blankets and food for the walk home. Told me about a coastal town on the other side of the forest called Dwell. It was the last elvish city, and instead of going back the same way, take that way instead. Where do you think she is? Asked Frid Volde. I don't know, maybe nearby. Volde answered a little anxiously. I think that if we find her here, we might not succeed in bringing her back. San said, putting a blanket on the hill. They set up the camp to blend in and Volde cast a protective spell. The same spell that protected against crows and stuff. As long as it was quiet, they were safe. I think we can sleep peacefully tonight, Volde. I can feel her presence. Volde said, indicating on the coin that Volde would use it. Volde took out the coin and cast the spell. Arkazayun. There was a rustling in the bushes and an incredibly beautiful young woman stepped forward. She had cloth wrapped around her chest and stomach and her hair lay curly and golden along her shoulders. They stood still as she stepped forward. Into the middle of the group. W. Volde. Volde croaked, sounding almost dismayed but very happy. I know who you are, Volde. I know who Frid is and I know who San is. I know Volde and I know Flisai. And Travis. She replied. My name is Leones. She replied. Her green eyes met Volde's blue and they stopped and studied each other. I know why you are here. Evil awakens. Leones said. After a moment he crouched down and smiled. You need not be afraid, for I know evil quite well. He said, looking at Volde and Volde, San, and Frid. You came for Sarosis, she has left the forest for the dwarf hall. Leones said. Dwarves and elves in the same place? Volde finally asked. No, for the big forest in Dvargsala. Leones replied. Yes. Volde finally said and crouched down with the help of the staff. The king of Lindia plows freely here. Leones said, adding. He doesn't notice that the trolls have gone wild. Leones said, getting up and walking over to Volde and stroking his cheek. Leones smiled and spun around gracefully. There is a man named Cascara, I can feel his evil all the way here, he will betray them. Leones said. Smiling broadly again. I felt it on me. Said Frid, he's been after me the whole time. Replied Frid. I know Frid, he and Boldiswal. Leones said, and a bond of friendship was formed. You have the chosen one with you, so tell me Volde, what shall we do next? Asked Leones. Take us to the dwell. Volde answered and looked at Volde, who nodded and said. Travis can lead you to dwell and home, my place is with the king. Volde replied. And they were genuinely surprised but nobody said anything. Asterisk. Frid looked at Volde and then at Leones, her thoughts were free and she perceived Leones as something very special, just like Volde. San was surprised too and for some reason there was nothing more to say. I can lead you out of the woods and into the dwell, Travis said, not taking this very seriously. There was something very special about what Travis did and what Volde did. I wish you luck, said Volde and patted Volde on the shoulder where he was crouching. See you, said Volde, walking his way with the staff as a walking stick. And Volde protect the rod and the girl. Volde shouted as he disappeared into the shadows. We camp here, Travis said, meaning it but wanting to tell the girl. We have some catching up to do. Leones said, settling down on the blanket that belonged to Volde. Volde sat down next to Leones and laced his fingers around the winding staff. We have to decide what to do next, Travis said, sitting down next to Frid where he had been standing. Between Frisai and Volde towards the eastern part of the fireplace. It's not an easy thing to travel back and forth. How much money do we have, San? Frid asked, looking at San, who wasn't blushing at all. 2,000 something. San replied, looking really pleased. Frid leaned back like Leones and blushed slightly as she looked up at the treetops. Frisai started cooking in the cauldron and as soon as they were there they started feeling sleepy. San played a tune and they chatted a bit and offered Leones food. Leones in turn told about the prophecies and how she learned them as a child and how she met the camp's new members, the wolves. She didn't call herself a demigod, but knew there was something to it and the dreams. Considering the dreams, Frid still had the salve and San and Volde had lost their caskets. At least they oiled themselves up before the sun went down and at least they managed to fall asleep at night. They were very tired and full. Frisai told of his time in the castle as a medic, how hard all the intrigues had developed against him, and the academy. The academy had had enormous power in the 100th century, and 17 years later it had weakened. Frid told about Voldeswall and Cascara. When Travis then snored, they started to fall asleep one by one. In the morning only Frid and Leones were awake. For some reason they started talking about Cascara and the awakening evil. It had been forbidden for a while to mention Serwin by name, but they did now, because the evil was said to be getting stronger every time. So the one was defeated by you? Leones asked, quietly looking at Frid with a small smile. Yes, he had taken the form of a beggar boy and was drawn to the song. Then he transformed into his true self. That's when Volde and the rest defeated him, replied Frid, where she sat brushing her hair by the campfire. It sounds like the one. He has an incredible effect when it comes to destroying, Leones said, smiling. As wide as before. Evil takes its time, but he has brothers. These belong to Serwin and are generals and selected from the inner circle, just like the one. They are demons and magicians, all with different ranks, Leones said, standing up so his stomach was showing. It was incredibly beautiful with squares like Frid. I don't know much about evil, but Volde and Travis are already hunting them, replied Frid. Evil has 8 generals not counting the one, so when they wake up we don't know, but they will show themselves. Fowl is next to appear at the same time as the one. His name is actually Drake, and Drake is as cunning as the one. I feel his presence somewhere, Leones said, sitting down next to Frid. We have to go to Bergamin, Frid said, looking at Leones, who nodded. Leones' soft voice had awakened San and Volde, who joined them by the fire opposite them. Yes, to Bergamin or to Tavel, San said, drinking some beer from a drinking horn. We are being hunted in Bergamin, if you don't remember that, Frid? San said, getting up to grab some food. It was maybe 5 in the morning and the sun was coming up. Hunted or not, we have to deal with Voldeswall, Volde replied, accepting a drinking horn of beer from San. San Lum sat drinking from his drinking horn when Frid asked him to play a song. San reached for the flute and began to play a strange tune that he had played long ago before the adventure with the one. It was called As the Wind Blows and was about a boat on dangerous waters. After the show they sat and talked while Travis and Faisai woke up. They prepared breakfast and made tea while San played songs and laughed with the girls. They got ready to leave and cleaned up the camp site, and the silent wolves disappeared into the forest. Leones told her that her wolves, Khan and Rez, came and went as they pleased and that they would stay in the forest. It was a long way to dwell, Travis told him, and they would have to camp one more time in the woods before dwell. Both Faisai and Travis took their packs and began their trek forward. The road was twisty and full of precipices and big trees. There were snakes everywhere, and once they were on their way they didn't stop until the sun was going down. The great forest beckoned with dangers. San was exhausted when they finally stopped at a clearing and set up camp. They were then halfway from dwell. Volde and Frid helped set up the camp while Leones and Travis gathered firewood. Faisai and San prepared a pot of water from a nearby stream. We camp here, Faisai said, smiling at San, who was a little groggy from walking all day. Sure, San replied, looking really tired. Finally, he had chopped up some tomato and onion. There was a giant turnip which Faisai prepared and some dried and salted meat. They took some pieces of bread and cheese and set about cutting radishes. The soldiers had packed them tightly, and San didn't want to know where the food came from. It was surely the king's own. San hung the small cauldron by the campfire, over 4 gnarled branches, and poured in the vegetables and meat. Soon a friendly scent wafted over them, and Volde began to play his flute, and soon they were exhausted and thirsty. The sun was setting and soon set behind the earth's crust. The nocturnal animals came to life and the birds chirped loudly, and here and there you could see shining eyes. San was really tired and fell asleep as soon as he had anointed himself with the salve. Would they really face Voldeswall after all the hunting? Strange, thought San. But he slept really well that night. Asterisk. Chapter 7 Dwell. Volde Callahan was ready to begin the journey to Dwell. He had dreamed beautiful dreams during the night and they had discussed the dreams together. Leonce had blushed when he told her about her, though she then hid it with a smile. She explained that it was the only way to travel in dreams if you owned nothing but your clothes. Volde believed her at first and they talked as they walked towards the Dwell. Travis and Faisai took the lead and were spoken to, and Faisai told about his medications in Bergamo. Faisai was 60 years of age and was very vigorous for having reached that age. Faisai also told about Boldeswall, how he had put him under arrest for suspecting witchcraft. It was not easy to evade Boldeswall, he said, and Frid, who overheard the conversation, agreed. When they finally came out of the forest, they were greeted by tall grass and rocks. The yellow grass in the east was well known in Tavel, for it was here that the bread was baked in Alderney and sailed to Tavel. Dwell was a long way away, but they would get there before dark. Dwell was also known for its fabrics and tobacco. Volde and Leonce, Frid, and San and Faisai stopped while Travis looked around and returned after a moment to look at them. It's almost time to enter the hunting grounds of Dwell, we must hurry now, Travis said, and they started stomping into the field. Volde and San had practiced almost every night with staff and sword, and as soon as they stopped, the flutes came forward, but now they were unsure if they would not stay for a while. But when they got some distance along the road, San began to dance and play along the road. Volde tried sometimes, but he held the staff he had named Fire after fire, and he no longer had much trouble with its thoughts, and maybe it was because the evil was not close. It was 3 hours before they saw Dwell, and when they did they went straight into the city. They were met by elves and humans working with a cart, and the town, no bigger than Tavel, could have saved them a lot of time from the start, Volde thought. Travis asked them to wait outside an inn that was in the middle of the city and surrounded by stone houses similar to those in Alderney's capital. People greeted them and sounded genuinely friendly, and some asked where they were from, and Volde answered Tavel. Others had caught sight of Leonce and seemed quite shocked at how beautiful she was. Her daring attire kept Frid and San at bay when they actually went to buy wool and fresh bread. They bought enough sweet pastries and juice to see them through the worst of hunger. The elves were really amused when San told them about the trolls and their surprise attacks. They also promised to put more guards at the city wall. When Travis finally came back and told them they got a room on the Wheel, as the inn was called, they were really happy. It was a real surprise that the trip was finally almost over. Travis waved them in, and Volde, he was finally on his way to a room of his own. Once inside the tall building, they were met with tobacco smoke and festivities. They had their own band playing beautiful music, and the room down there was full of the smell of food and friendly people. Volde finally got into his room and didn't bother to wash himself the first thing he did. Then he changed into clean clothes and began to wash his outer coat. He put on a feathered hat San had bought and went down with the staff in hand. The shirt was a white shirt and wool vest with an inside pocket for the coin. The trousers Volde wore were also woolen and really finely woven and thick for the cold. In Lindia, when Volde came down the wooden stairs, Faisai and Frid were sitting at a table eating, and Volde walked up to them. Volde ordered a bottle of wine and the house food and sat down next to Faisai. I was thinking of eating a little, Frid said, and smiled at Volde, a smile he hadn't seen in a long time. No danger, thought to eat some myself, answered Volde, drinking wine from a glass. It's when you eat, you need company, Faisai said, taking a bite of a sweet root and dipping the bread into the golden sauce. Soon the rest of the party came down, and Leonce was wearing a long elvish dress. Volde thought she looked radiant. They then sat down next to Volde, and Travis ordered food for them. It was nice company, Volde thought, and as soon as they had food on the table they got into the mood. They drank and ate that night, and finally they felt like going to bed and did so. The night passed slowly, and Volde fell asleep after anointing himself. The hours rolled on, and when Volde woke up again he was anew. Volde, who hadn't felt so well for a long time. They gathered down there at the counter and ate breakfast. At last they were really ripe to set off for Bergaman, and Travis went down to the harbor to find a boat. A boat it was, he found, and finally they went off to an elvish frigate that sailed them where they wanted. Travis was careful to choose the right one because a pirate ship had been seen several times and he didn't want to risk anything. Volde boarded the long ship, followed by San and Leons. Frid, Faisai and Travis were already on board. They didn't have to share a cabin this time, and when the boat was really about to launch at 7 a.m. they got to meet the captain called Aeneas. Aeneas was a tall elf with a friendly appearance and the butcher beside the embroidered uniform. Volde then ended up in the cabin and fell asleep pretty soon and woke up in the afternoon. Finally he ended up in the dining room playing dice with Captain Aeneas and the rest of the party. Aeneas told about pirates and sailors who had ended up having to abandon ship. He told about when he sailed cloth to Tavel and Bergaman, but Tavel was closed this year. They ate and talked in between about the adventures, and finally it was time for food again. Volde then went to sleep and left the company there. He washed and put on clothes. This would take 2 days at most. It wasn't far to Bergaman, but the winds could be treacherous. Frid and Leon sat talking about dresses and clothes while San played his flute. They were simply in good company again, and finally they could finally relax and really talk about the interests they had, and Frid got closer and closer to Leon's about her beauty and what a secret she had. Frid did not realize that Frid herself was really beautiful, and both of them could not keep the men away from them in any way. "Tell me, Leons, what do you do in Alderney?" asked Frid, a little drunk from the booze and beer. "Peace in Alderney, you hunt for your survival. The trolls are on the warpath, your spear can tell, right?" Leons replied a bit modestly, and they ended up really managing to stick together that night. Leons on the right side of the dining room table and Frid next to the left. Finally they didn't talk much but said good night and went their separate ways. They had both gotten drunk, and Travis Faisai had already gone to bed by himself. When Frid finally came to, she took off her clothes and anointed herself with various ointments that Faisai had given her. They were simple salves and the salve for sleep problems. She then went and laid down in the linen she had put on. Her dreams were free and she could sleep peacefully that night. As usual, she felt tired from the journey, and it was apparently common with the others as well. Volde had gone to bed the earliest of all, and that way Frid could sleep peacefully. When she finally woke up, it was a little colder in the air and most people were out on deck talking while sailing with full sails. Frid spoke to Aeneas and was given permission to go as she pleased. No permission was needed, Aeneas told her, but Frid insisted on asking anyway. When it was finally time for rest and food, the dice rolled out and they played for a long time. Voted 55. Leon 77. Peace 54. San 67. Travis 89. Face 78. Travis won almost all the time and told us that the secret was not in rolling the dice but how they were rolled. Frid felt really amused and tried, but she didn't succeed very well. Finally, it was time for food. And they talked about Bergaman. The rest of the day they played dice and admired the elvish ship with its trim on the sailcloth, and in the dining room they discussed what to do in Bergaman, and Travis told them that the safest thing would be to talk to Tavel, who was probably already in Bergaman. He had ways to stop Boldiswall already at the port if need be. "I think I know Fowl more and more closely," Leons finally said. "Could he and Boldiswall and Cascara have anything to do with each other?" Volde finally asked. Sitting next to Travis at the rectangular table, across from Leons and Frid's. "I'm sure Boldiswall and Fowl have already met," Leons said. "And the evil of the fowl or drake is quite great," Leons said. Frid nodded and watched them both, at the same time wondering if it wasn't time to plan. "I think Tavel gets to deal with Fowl, but we need to talk to him first." Travis said in response, and for a while Fred was with it all, but he didn't understand Fowl at all. Fowl has a weakness, and it is Volde because he is the light bringer. Leon said, smiling widely. Fred agreed, and finally they took some bread and chicken with beer and wine. They didn't want to spoil the party, and when it was time the flute came forward and San played several songs with rhythm in them. Volde took his flute and followed the beats, and that night was saved. Fred went to bed and it was 12 o'clock at night. The others continued the party, and when Fred came to, she lubricated herself again and went to sleep. San Lum sat and played all night so that it was really felt when he finally went to sleep. He whistled cheerfully as he came to and undressed to wash himself. Volde had told him about the undead, and San remembered them quite well as many and dangerous mages. Maybe this fowl was as evil as the one, and disturbed their dreams? Faisai had in any case made a new salve for him and for Volde. Now was the time to lube up, San thought, and did so, then went to bed. San was tired and fell asleep pretty quickly. That night, when he finally woke up, it was morning and he felt the winter chill in the air and the taste of salt water. San didn't like Bergamon's harbor, but he recognized it everywhere else. San got up and put on his clothes to finally go out when he was ambushed by guards. San drew his sword just as quickly, bringing them down with 2 quick swipes. San rushed out into the hallway and knocked on the doors of his friends, and they came rushing out with guns drawn. He's here, Fowl is here, Leon shouted from outside, and San and Volde ran out of the boat onto the deck. There stood a tall black-clad man, pale and serious, with his hands in deep magic. Volde readied a spell and threw it at Fowl, who was thrown backwards but quickly got up. Soon guards swarmed around them and San began to slash his way forward. He made his way over to Volde and stood next to him. Volde threw a fireball at Fowl, which was hit and flew backwards off the boat into the water. Volde tossed around the guards with an invisible hand until Leon stopped him. It's over, Fowl is dead, Leone said comfortingly. They were attached to him? Volde asked, looking at the fleeing guards. Yes, they were, Leon's replied, patting Volde on the shoulder. San looked at the 14 guards he had killed and looked at Volde. We should probably go to Tavel, San said, realizing he was freezing. Travis, who came out last, heard the last. Well, whatever, the castle is almost better, Travis said, and they prepared to leave. Travis paid Nes, and they sailed away with the dead guards and tossed them overboard. San followed Travis, and when they finally finished packing, they hired a horse and carriage for the trip to the castle. Oldeswall had been close this time but had not quite succeeded in stopping them. When they had finally passed through the great city, they arrived at the castle and the academy. There, they met Tagal, who told them that Oldeswall had asked to enter but he had been refused. Oldeswall had then left and no one knew where he had gone. Tagal was tall and stocky and had the traditional monk's cap over his head. He was as bearded as Travis, and they then partied the night away before finally deciding to head home to Tavel. Fred, Leons, Faisai, Travis, San and Volde went home and finally did what they used to do, waiting for the evil to wake up. Leons had to go with it, Travis had promised. Evil rises again they had experienced, it was a question of when it did, but that it did was certain.